All right, today we're jumping into Ezekiel chapter 14, and this is a really powerful passage written right in the middle of a massive national crisis. It tackles some huge questions about God's justice, what personal righteousness means, and, what it actually takes to survive. Let's get right into it.
Okay, so to really get what's happening here, you've got to understand the timeline. Ezekiel is prophesying in 593 BCE. Now, this is such a critical moment. It's after the first wave of people were deported to Babylon, but it's before the final total destruction of Jerusalem. The air is just thick with tension, and that threat from Babylon, it is very, very real.
So God kicks things off in this passage by laying out a series of hypothetical, but, absolutely terrifying scenarios. He starts describing the tools, or the instruments he can use for judgment, and he starts with one of the most ancient and feared.
We see this first instrument of judgment right here in verse 17. God says he'll bring a sword upon that land. Now, this isn't just about a literal weapon. It's a really potent and common symbol in the Bible for something much, much bigger.
Yeah, that sword represents war and all its devastating consequences. For the people hearing Ezekiel say this, it wasn't some abstract idea. It was their reality. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon was literally using his armies to crush Judah. And what's really interesting here is that phrase, man and beast. It shows that the consequences of sin ripple through every part of a society, right down to the land and the economy.
Then, in verse 19, God introduces another instrument, pestilence. And again, this isn't random. Historically, disease and plague always went hand in hand with war. You have sieges, famine, and that weakens everybody. This would have been a chillingly familiar idea to Ezekiel's audience.
Okay, so this is where the passage gets into a really crucial and maybe kind of difficult principle. God basically poses a question. What happens to the truly good people, the righteous ones, who are living in a deeply corrupt nation? Can their goodness actually save everyone else?
And to make his point, God uses three absolute legends of righteousness as his standard. He pulls out the A-team. You've got Noah, the guy who survived the global flood. You've got Daniel, who kept his integrity in the heart of the Babylonian Empire, and Job, who endured just unimaginable personal disaster. These are the best of the best.
Verse 18 gives us the answer, and it is stark. God says even if these three giants of faith were right there in the land, their personal righteousness could not save the nation. It couldn't even save their own kids. The critical point here is that their faithfulness only guarantees their own survival.
So you see this really clear principle emerging, right? Personal righteousness is powerful. For sure, it's protective for the individual, but it has its limits. It can't just cancel out the collective consequences when an entire society has gone off the rails. There's a really sharp line drawn between individual accountability and the fate of the nation.
And just so nobody misses the point, God says it all over again in verse 20. In the Bible, when something is repeated so deliberately like this, it's like a giant divine underline. The message is crystal clear. Individual responsibility is everything. Daniel's righteousness saved him in Babylon, sure, but it didn't stop the suffering of the entire exiled nation.
All right, let's keep going, because now God takes these hypothetical judgments and applies them directly and with no ambiguity to one specific place, Jerusalem.
All these warnings start to pile up into what the text calls the four sore judgments. So we're not just talking about one calamity anymore. We're talking about a comprehensive wave of destruction, the sword, famine, wild animals, and pestilence, the whole shebang.
And then in verse 21, the hypothetical becomes terrifyingly real. God applies this directly to Jerusalem. He says that because of its persistent sin, it's not going to face just one of these things, but all four. This just underscores that the coming judgment is going to be total and unavoidable.
And, tragically, history shows us this is exactly what happened. The prophecy was fulfilled. Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, the temple was destroyed, and the people were either killed, enslaved, or exiled, leaving the city in ruins. The warning became a historical fact.
But right when the passage seems to be at its absolute darkest, just full of nothing but judgment and destruction, there's a dramatic and, honestly, a surprising turn.
After all of this devastation, is that it? Is it just over? Is the final word simply destruction? Well, the text kind of anticipates that we'd be asking that question.
And incredibly, the answer is no. Verse 22 reveals the twist. A remnant will survive. Right in the middle of this total judgment, God promises to preserve a small group of survivors, sons and daughters who will be brought out of the ruin.
But why? You got to ask, what's their purpose? Well, this remnant isn't just a lucky group that made it. They are living, breathing proof that God's actions were just and had a purpose, that it wasn't just arbitrary rage. They're a real, tangible sign of both his discipline and his promise for a future, a promise that was later fulfilled by the people who returned from exile with Ezra and Nehemiah.
And all of this brings us to the final, powerful conclusion of the passage. It all comes down to the ultimate reason for this entire devastating event and the role that the survivors play in helping everyone understand it.
Verse 23 gives us the ultimate takeaway. The lives of this remnant would serve as a really strange kind of comfort to the other exiles. How? Well, by seeing them, by observing their lives, everyone would understand that God's severe judgment wasn't without cause. It was just. And from this perspective, it was actually necessary.
So you can see the logic flowing here, right? The remnant survives. Other people see their righteous ways. This brings the comfort that comes from understanding, which ultimately validates that what God did was just. It's a pretty remarkable theological argument when you break it down.
And that, right there, is the heart of this entire passage. It's a profound statement that God's judgment is never just random. It's corrective, it is just, and it always has a purpose, even when it is incredibly painful to witness or to live through. Which leaves us with this final, really challenging thought from the text. How can destruction bring comfort? It's a complex idea, isn't it? That maybe, just maybe, understanding the why behind suffering can provide some kind of solace, even when you're facing immense loss. It's definitely something to think about.